Welcome to the Human Dignity by Design podcast, where we explore tech law in context and discuss how law and technology can and should be designed to respect human dignity. My name is Jan Trzaskowski, and I'm here to share research, thoughts and ideas on tech law and policy, including the role of fundamental human rights as guiding principles in business and beyond. The first 12 episodes of this podcast are an audiobook version of my 2021 book, Your Privacy is Important to Us, which explores how to restore human dignity in data-driven marketing that relies on artificial intelligence. In this episode, you will hear the 8th chapter of Your Privacy is Important to Us, which is about manipulation, including issues pertaining to coercion, deception, subliminal marketing, and paternalism. Thank you for listening. Chapter 8. Manipulation. Manipulation is closely related to agency and the right to self-determination. As mentioned in Chapter 2, we use the term manipulation for the unlawful influence or behavior modification that includes both deception and coercion. Manipulation can be said to steer the choices of others by morally problematic means, including employing emotional vulnerabilities or character defects, in order to make us act against, or at the very least, without our better judgment. In his analysis of manipulation, Sunstein similarly finds that an action does not count as manipulative merely because it is an effort to alter people's behavior, and that there is a large difference between persuading people and manipulating them. In defining manipulation, Sunstein suggests focusing on whether the effort in question does sufficiently engage or appeal to the consumer's capacity for reflection and deliberation, and where the word sufficiently leaves a degree of ambiguity and openness, and properly so. This is similar to the fine line that must be drawn between legitimate influence and illegal distortion of the average consumer's behavior under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. It could also be argued that to be able to objectively ascertain whether consent is given, there must be a sufficient engagement of or appeal to the data subject's capacity for reflection and deliberation, as discussed above in Chapter 4, in the context of genuine choice and the interpretation of the Planet 49 case. Sunstein states that no legal system has a general tort called exploitation of cognitive biases. But both the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and the GDPR may be interpreted as including a prohibition of manipulation within the above-mentioned definition, that is, focusing on the lack of engaging or appealing to the consumer's capacity for reflection. The Unfair Commercial Practices Directive explicitly mentions coercion, and the prohibition of misleading commercial practices could be interpreted to mean the absence of deception. 1. Manipulative commercial practices. Under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, a commercial practice is aggressive if, in its factual context, taking account of all its features and circumstances, by harassment, coercion, including the use of physical force or undue influence, it is likely to A. significantly impair the average consumer's freedom of choice or conduct, and B. cause him to take a transactional decision that he would not have taken otherwise. Undue influence exists when a trader exploits a position of power in relation to the consumer, so as to apply pressure, even without physical force, if it is likely to significantly impair the average consumer's freedom of choice or conduct. Account must be taken of, among other things, A. its timing, location, nature, or persistence, as well as B. the use of threatening or abusive language or behavior. From its wording, this list is not exhaustive. It follows from Recital 16 of the Directive that the provisions on aggressive commercial practices should cover those practices which significantly impair the consumer's freedom of choice. Undue influence is not necessarily impermissible influence, but that is the case when conducts apply a certain degree of pressure, and in the factual context actively entail the forced conditioning of the consumer's will in a way that is likely to significantly impair the average consumer's freedom of choice or conduct. The Court of Justice of the European Union has established that it does not constitute an aggressive commercial practice to ask the consumer to take his final transactional decision without having time to study, at his convenience, the documents delivered to him by a courier, if the consumer has been in a position to take cognizance of the standard form contracts before. However, the Court of Justice found that certain additional practices with the aim of limiting the consumer's freedom of choice may lead to the commercial practice being regarded as aggressive. This includes conducts that put pressure on the consumer, such as that his freedom of choice is significantly impaired, or establish an attitude that is liable to make the consumer feel uncomfortable, such as to confuse his thinking in relation to the transactional decision to be taken. Such pressure may, for instance, be induced by announcing that less favorable conditions are a consequence of delayed action on the part of the consumer, a means of utilizing Cialdini's scarcity lever of influence, as discussed in Chapter 6. Information may also constitute an important part of manipulative commercial practices, and such practices may thus fall under both aggressive and misleading commercial practices under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. As discussed in Chapter 7, the design of human-computer interaction plays a significant role in how consumers are influenced in the context of data-driven business models. Technology can be automated to both observe and shape our behavior at scale. Some people prefer to use the term dark patterns for unfair practices used in computer design to trick people into certain behaviors. Here we use choice architecture as a neutral term, recognizing that the choice architecture may be designed to manipulate users. The Court of Justice of the European Union has assumed that the average consumer is generally aware of how advertising and sales promotions work in a free market economy, and that today's consumers are much more circumspect and informed as a result of their experience with marketing, and also that the protection of consumers is a patronizing argument which is no longer convincing. However, it is not impossible that pervasive exposure to personalized marketing, including the use of prompts and the manipulation of emotions, based on online tracking across platforms, coupled with annoying cookie consent boxes, has resulted in additional confusion, cognitive overload, and apathy rather than real education. As expressed by James Williams, so the main risk information abundance possess is not that one's attention will be occupied or used by information as though it were some finite quantifiable resource, but rather that one will lose control over one's attentional processes. Similarly, Tim Wu. We are at risk, without quite fully realizing it, of living lives that are less our own than we imagine. 1.1. The average consumer online. As mentioned in Chapter 5, an average consumer must be constructed from the audience to which the marketing is exposed or directed. When personalization and segmentation are in use, it could be argued that the group of people from which the average is constructed should be narrowed accordingly. As mentioned, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive also applies in cases where the commercial practice only applies to one person. The low cost of communication, including by establishing a website or social media presence, sending an email or creating an app, makes it economically viable to target large audiences in order to profit from only a small group of consumers in the long tail. In that vein, it would make sense to consider whether a particular business model is designed to take undue advantage of certain vulnerable consumers. This will have an impact on how the group of consumers from which the average consumer must be constructed is to be defined. The situation can be illustrated by so-called subscription traps, where consumers are given an extraordinarily good offer, for instance a free smartphone. The consumer must provide payment details to pay for shipping, but the fine print reveals a subscription to a worthless service. The trader has been careful in his design to ensure that consumers do not read the information about the subscription. Say that 1 million consumers are exposed to the offer, 5,000 react, and 500 end up accepting the deal. Let us assume that all of the consumers are surprised by the subscription, and 450 of them decide to return the phone and settle with the trader by paying €100 in fear of legal consequences. And the remaining 50 consumers successfully challenge the validity of the contract. It should be obvious that it is not trivial which group the average consumer is constructed from. The issue seems more to be a matter of professional diligence, but as the requirements are cumulative, the average consumer cannot be ignored. The question of how to construct the average consumer in the context of personalization and segmentation is not settled in law. The same is the case for understanding consent and information under the GDPR in light of the average user. For the GDPR, it would be a practical solution to apply some sort of average user, but at least in principle, the envisaged rights and protection appear more personalized under the GDPR than under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. 1.2. We are all vulnerable. Data-driven marketing may be delivered with surgical precision at an industrial scale, which allow for identifying A. vulnerable individuals, groups, and/or B. particular vulnerable aspects in all of us individually. It is not difficult to, for instance, market payday loans to people who are likely to be interested in gambling. Targeted advertising is profitable and exploitable by means of automation in a free market system. If the group from which the average user is constructed is too broad, collateral damage is likely to be high. A level of collateral damage must be accepted in marketing law. That is, the distortion of some consumers' economic behavior is foreseen, because consumers come in many flavors. When marketing is personalized, the argument for collateral damage weakens, however, as the need for an abstraction disappears with concrete identification. 2. Lawful processing of personal data. Both marketing and personalization of products are legitimate purposes for the processing of personal data. However, what is not settled is the extent to which proportionality allows for personalization and segmentation, including, in particular, when it is used for manipulation. It follows from Article 5.1a that processing must be both lawful and fair. With regard to legitimate basis for processing, consent is required for personalization that is not objectively necessary for the purpose of the underlying contract. For example, where personalized content delivery is intended to increase user engagement with a service. 2.1. Data minimization and storage limitation. Personal data must be limited to what is necessary in relation to the purposes for which they are processed, and not kept longer than is necessary for the purposes for which the personal data are processed. It is not settled in case law from the Court of Justice of the European Union how much information for the purposes of marketing is necessary and for how long it is necessary to store such data. These principles are particularly relevant in the context of data-driven marketing that identifies correlations beyond the capacity of human imagination, including by analyzing data over time. In that vein, it could be argued that any data, in principle, could be relevant for marketing purposes. Any behavior, including for instance typing speed, mouse hovering, phrases used in personal emails, etc., could provide insights that could eventually prove to be important for identifying traits that are relevant for exposure to marketing. These principles, as well as other principles, should also be understood in the context of data protection by design and by default in Article 25 of the GDPR. According to this provision, the trader must, with a view to compliance with the GDPR, integrate necessary safeguards into the processing and implement appropriate technical and organizational measures, including those that will ensure that, by default, only personal data which are necessary for each specific purpose of the processing are processed. Without drawing a particular line, it is safe to assume that these principles set a threshold for what data the trader can use for marketing purposes, regardless of the legitimate basis, including consent on which the trader relies. The European Data Protection Board and the European Data Protection Supervisor consider that the use of AI to infer emotions of a natural person is highly undesirable and should be prohibited. 2.2. Automated individual decision-making, including profiling. As discussed in Chapter 4, the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, may limit the use of personal data for marketing purposes, provided the processing produces legal effect or similar significant effect on the data subject. This issue is not settled in case law, but we find it reasonable to assume that personalized marketing, at least to some extent, amounts to automated individual decision-making, including profiling that has legal or similar effect. 2.3. Pop-ups. One widespread and illustrative use case of persuasive technology in data-driven business models is found in the context of cookie consent pop-ups. Article 5.3 of the e-privacy directive requires neither consent nor a pop-up to inform the user about cookies that are strictly necessary for carrying out the transmission. In most, if not all cases, the cookie consent pop-up is a prompt designed to obtain consent for cookies that are not necessary for the transmission. Thus, it could be argued that this prompt in itself could be an unnecessary disruptive to the use of the service, as mentioned in Recital 32 of the GDPR, and may constitute an aggressive commercial practice under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. Pop-up dialog boxes are widely used as prompts in human-computer interaction, as a warning that requires the user to confirm an action, for instance delete file. So even though these prompts are intended as warnings concerning privacy, we may be conditioned to perceive them as a request for confirmation. This is further corroborated by the widespread use of cookie consent pop-ups that may instill a click fatigue, in particular when the design varies from one website to another, and the prompt is only persistent until the user has performed the task desired by the trader. It follows from Article 7.3 of the GDPR that it shall be as easy to withdraw as to give consent. From a friction perspective, this could mean that the user should be similarly prompted at every visit after consent is given, and that the dialog box should make it equally easy to reject cookies. The consent pop-up may be carefully designed to animate a particular behavior by increasing motivation and/or ability. Motivation can be increased by the wording or framing, coupled with relevant storytelling, as discussed in Chapter 9. Friction can be dispensed by the availability of options or buttons, as well as by such elements as their relative placement, sizing, and coloring. Consent is normally given in a fraction of a moment by a user who is eager to access the content to which the pop-up is a barrier. A choice between OK and later or manage preferences makes it more likely that the average user will consent, since it's the most frictionless option. In contrast to computer prompts, the dialog box can seldom be closed by hitting the escape key. Occasionally, no alternative to OK is offered. The requirements of data protection by design and by default must at least entail equal friction to consent and not consent, and possibly more friction to consent to avoid it being consent by default. Given the intrusive consequences of tracking cookies and the fundamental rights being protected, it seems insufficient that the user is merely left with a guide on how to remove cookies in the browser settings. Eventually, the courts must, considering the requirements of professional diligence and data protection by design and by default, determine whether the choice architecture is designed to sufficiently engage and appeal to the user's capacity for reflection and deliberation, as discussed above, as well as whether it is possible in practice to ascertain objectively whether it is a clear affirmative action that signifies agreement to the processing. One could add that to the extent tracking is assumed to be in accordance with the user's goals, values, and preferences, the trader should have no problem with adding a bit of friction by, for instance, replacing the cookie consent pop-up with an unobstructive "Please track me" button, knowing that people hate waiting and don't mind clicking. 3. Subliminal marketing. Subliminal marketing covers techniques that are designed to engage people subconsciously. Subliminal is derived from sub, below, and limen, threshold. Subliminal messages are visual or auditory stimuli that are not perceived by the conscious mind. Article 9.1b of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive explicitly prohibits, per se, the use of subliminal techniques in audiovisual commercial communication, including television. The concept of subliminal techniques has resurfaced in Article 5 of the Proposal for an Artificial Intelligence Act. The proposed regulation aims to prohibit a number of particularly harmful AI practices, including a. The placing on the market, putting into service, or use of an AI system that deploys subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness in order to materially distort a person's behavior in a manner that causes or is likely to cause that person or another person physical or psychological harm. The focus on subliminal techniques is interesting as 1. Many aspects of data-driven business models remain beyond the user's consciousness, and 2. These techniques are generally recognized as unlawful per se, and thus are likely to constitute an aggressive practice under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. According to the explanatory memorandum to the proposed regulation, the focus should be on practices that have significant potential to manipulate persons through subliminal techniques beyond their consciousness. It is relevant to note that the proposed Artificial Intelligence Act focuses on physical and psychological harm, but not economic harm as regulated in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. Also, for subliminal marketing, it remains an open question whether member states can regulate it as a matter of taste and decency to prevent, for instance, psychological harm, as we discuss in Chapter 10. 4. Attention, engagement, and addiction. Companies that rely on reselling attention may improve their revenue by 1. Encouraging engagement to increase the amount of attention, and/or 2. Using personal data or other information to increase the value of attention. The reselling of attention or encouragement of engagement are not in themselves aggressive commercial practices. As attention is the real value, traders may be incentivized to become increasingly aggressive in their efforts to attract and maintain the attention of users, especially when their tactics are opaque to the user. With inspiration from behavioral sciences, traders have tools, including gamification techniques such as offering the chance to collect points, benefits, that can create addictions and dependencies, which may not only challenge the user's autonomy, but also have real societal implications, as we discuss in Chapter 10. For Facebook, likes and the newsfeed condition addictive behavior in ways which are comparable to slot machines, drugs, and other addictive technologies that are heavily regulated. If you're not convinced, consider how often and, in particular, when and why your friends pay attention to their smartphones. Autoplay is another pervasive feature that can remove friction by not engaging or appealing to the user's capacity for reflection and deliberation. Video and/or audio elements automatically start playing after some triggering event, such as payload, approaching the end of a series, or when navigating to a particular region of the web page. It may seem harmless, even desirable, that, for instance, the subsequent episode of a television series starts automatically. However, considering the efficiency of increasing attention, it could be argued that it is an aggressive commercial practice to not prompt the users to reflect. The same argument can be made against subscriptions where automatic promptless renewal is the default. Traders' access to data on behavior allows them to both gauge and manufacture engagement. Attention may be increased and conditioned by creating conflict, outrage, and social exclusion in social media services. Societal impacts may not be the intention, but rather a consequence of optimizing algorithms for attention and engagement. 4.1. Exploitation. Alan W. Wood mentions exploitation, which overlaps with coercion and manipulation, as objections that can be raised in the context of advertising, and he observes that exploitation includes making use of the vulnerabilities of others for your ends, Article 5 of the above-mentioned proposal for an Artificial Intelligence Act also aims to prohibit certain exploitations of vulnerabilities, that is, the placing on the market, putting into service or use of an AI system that exploits any of the vulnerabilities of a specific group of persons due to their age, physical or mental disability in order to materially distort the behavior of a person pertaining to that group in a manner that causes or is likely to cause that person or another person physical or psychological harm. Addictive and persuasive design or technology may be more a matter of human well-being and product safety than marketing law and data protection law. However, the awareness of its existence and the implications thereof may be important in a holistic assessment of the legality of data-driven business models, including the extent to which the use of personal data is appropriate, considering the requirement of legitimacy and accountability. The same goes for commercial practices, where full account should be taken of the context of the individual case. Even though the proposed Artificial Intelligence Act aims to protect physical or psychological harm, exploitation of vulnerabilities like subliminal marketing has been identified as a particularly harmful AI practice, which could have a spillover effect to influence the interpretation of aggressive commercial practices in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. 5. Just add friction. The use of manipulation may render a commercial practice unfair and mean that consent is not obtained, which may lead to unlawful processing of personal data. However, friction, including prompts, may also be used to engage or appeal to the consumer's capacity for reflection and deliberation. This engages mental effort involved in System 2 thinking, which activates more vigorous and more analytical brain machinery. By adding friction, users' revealed preferences may become more aligned with their real preferences. However, friction may also add to ego depletion and decision fatigue, as discussed in Chapter 6. Thus, a balance must be found, as nobody has the time or cognitive resources to be completely thorough and accurate with every decision. This leads us to revisit freedom as an agency and self-determination as introduced in Chapter 6, and interferences with the consumer's free will, including paternalism and nudging. 5.1. Paternalism and the right to self-determination. The principle of free choice, agency, is important in both data protection law and marketing law, as well as being a fundamental principle that underpins the economic rationale behind markets. From a philosophical perspective, paternalism can be defined as the interference of a state or an individual with another person against their will. Given the powers of surveillance and behavior modification at traders' disposal, it may also make sense to emphasize that traders may interfere with citizens' right to self-determination. It has been argued that treating the design of digital technologies is the ground of first struggle for our freedom and self-determination. The idea of personal autonomy is that individuals are self-governing agents with the capacity to decide for oneself and pursue a course of action in one's life, often regardless of any particular moral content. However, autonomy and free choice are not the important part of this equation, given our prior assumption that people have agency. It is more important to discuss what interferences should be accepted, especially given the bounded nature of human rationality that we have also assumed. In economics, paternalism and its effect on the consumer's right to self-determination are often used in a narrow sense, including only state interference. This perspective on paternalism is often linked to an ideology in which it is unnecessary and even immoral to protect people against their choices. The presumption that individual choices should be respected is usually based on the claim that people do an excellent job at making choices. Similarly, Nobel laureates George A. Akerlof and Robert J. Shiller have noted that the storytelling related to the idea that free market economics, subject to the caveats of income distribution and externalities, yield the best of all possible worlds if everyone is free to choose, is derived from an unsophisticated interpretation of standard economics. As described by Barry Schwartz in an abstract for an article. Americans now live in a time and a place in which freedom and autonomy are valued above all else, and in which expanded opportunities for self-determination are regarded as a sign of the psychological well-being of individuals and the moral well-being of the culture. This article argues that freedom, autonomy, and self-determination can become excessive, and that when that happens, freedom can be experienced as a kind of tyranny. The article further argues that unduly influenced by the ideology of economics and rational choice theory, modern American society has created an excess of freedom, with resulting increases in people's dissatisfaction with their lives and in clinical depression. One significant task for a future psychology of optimal functioning is to de-emphasize individual freedom and to determine which cultural constraints are necessary for people to live meaningful and satisfying lives. Despite their intrinsic relationship, it may be fair to say that the right to self-determination is more important than the absence of paternalism, in whatever shape or form, and that the absence of manipulation is a prerequisite for meaningful self-determination. As discussed in Chapter 4, in the context of consent, freedom of choice may be challenged by the trader's market power, including network effects, and the user's interest in or dependence on their services. If, for instance, a particular school or the majority of a class decides to use a Facebook competitor for school-related interactions, the choice may be less free, as there is significant friction to not choosing this default. It may also be an interference with the right to self-determination if consent cannot be withdrawn without insignificant detriment. On this backdrop, it may make sense to perceive the principle of both self-determination and paternalism in a market context as a protection from unwanted interference from both state and traders, with the view to preserve personal autonomy of the consumer. The word unwanted is intended to introduce the same degree of ambiguity and openness as the word sufficiently in Sunstein's above-mentioned definition of manipulation. Freedom depends on the number and importance of the things that one A is free to do and B autonomously want to do. Freedom might thus be said to describe not only the size of our option set, but also our awareness of what options there are. In that sense, the right to self-determination depends not only on freedom to choose or consent, but also on the ability to create some sense of transparency, as discussed in Chapter 9. If transparency cannot be established, there may be good arguments for state intervention in the guise of regulation. In the context of privacy, it has been argued that consumer privacy interventions can enable choice, while the alternative, pure marketplace approaches can deny consumers opportunities to exercise autonomy. Insights from behavioral sciences, including persuasive technology, may be used to reconsider the idea of empowered consumers as an argument for uncontested belief in the right to self-determination and a fear of paternalism. As noted in the 1960s by British legal philosopher Herbert L.A. Hart. Paternalism, as a tool for protecting individuals against themselves, is a perfectly coherent policy. Later noting that choices may be made or consent may be given without adequate reflection or appreciation of the consequences, or in pursuit of merely transitory desires, or in various predicaments when the judgment is likely to be clouded, or under inner psychological compulsion, or under pressure by others of a kind too subtle to be susceptible of proof in a law court. An argument against state intervention is that consumers are the best qualified to determine their preferences, which we challenged in Chapter 6. The state may have the best intentions, but it does not know what our individual preferences are. Conversely, while traders may have much better insights into individual preferences than consumers have themselves, their intention may not be aligned with the best interest of individual consumers. A desired level of paternalism is a political choice, taking into account both economic efficiency and social welfare, as we discuss in Chapter 10. It seems as though paternalism, that is, accepting state interference and limiting commercial interference, is less controversial throughout the European Union than it is in the US, where trust in markets seem to be higher than in state governments. 5.2. Nudging and defaults. Nudging is a means of paternalism, originally framed as libertarian paternalism, that applies findings within behavioral sciences to improve choice architecture. Nudging suggests that choice architecture should be designed so that people are nudged in a particular default direction, while they remain free to choose other options. As expressed by Richard H. Taylor and Cass R. Sunstein, a nudge, as we will use the term, is any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. To count as a mere nudge, the intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid. Nudges are not taxes, fines, subsidies, bans, or mandates. The paternalistic aspect lies in the claim that it is legitimate for choice architecture to try to influence people's behavior in order to make their lives longer, healthier, and better. In other words, we argue for self-conscious efforts by institutions in the private sector and by governments to steer people's choices in directions that will improve their lives. The goal for governments should be to ensure that if people do nothing at all, things will go well for them, including by establishing default rules that serve people's interest even if they do nothing at all. Here, we argue that the same standard could be used as inspiration for determining whether a commercial practice or request for consent is preserving the consumer's right to self-determination. Defaults are powerful nudges that are explicitly regulated in Article 25 of the GDPR on data protection by default, which may also spill over to the interpretation of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. It is, for instance, found that around 96% of iOS 14.5 users have decided to rely on restricted app tracking in Apple's app tracking transparency feature mentioned in Chapter 2. This could be seen as a clear indication of an obvious default for nudging, which, by the way, is well aligned with the requirement of data protection by design and by default. To illustrate the value of default, Google is estimated to pay $8 to $12 billion to Apple every year for making Google's search engine the default for Safari and using Google for Siri and Spotlight in response to general search queries. 5.3. Accountability and ethics. As mentioned in Chapter 4, accountability is an important principle in the GDPR that in particular ensures that authorities can gain insights into traders' compliance. Similarly, the above-mentioned proposal for an Artificial Intelligence Act suggests requirements concerning technical documentation for providers of high-risk AI. In its guidelines for AI, the Council of Europe suggests that AI applications should allow meaningful control by data subjects over the data processing and related effects on individuals and on society. Although there is not a similar requirement in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, transparency towards users may serve accountability purposes under both data protection law and marketing law, as we discuss in the following chapter. Ultimately, the determination of unwanted behavior modification is a normative question, in consideration of which ethics is likely to play a role. B.J. Fogg offered in 2003 the following ethical standard for the use of persuasive technology. To act ethically, the creators should carefully anticipate how their products might be used for an unplanned persuasive end, how it might be overused, or how it might be adopted by unintended users. Even if the unintended outcomes are not readily predictable, once the creators become aware of harmful outcomes, they should take action to mitigate them. Thank you for joining the Human Dignity by Design podcast, where we explore tech law in context. In the next episode, you can listen to the 9th chapter of Your Privacy is Important to Us, which is about transparency, including issues pertaining to information, communication, complexity, and asymmetry. Music for this podcast is composed and performed by Thomas Roe. My name is Jan Trzaskowski.